Over 1,100 workers. A factory in West Bromwich. Cars hand-built in leather and walnut for Frank Sinatra, Princess Anne, and a remarkable number of rock drummers. Jensen Motors made the first production car in the world with four-wheel drive and anti-lock brakes. 14 years before anyone else thought to try. Then came a new owner with an impossible ambition and a deal with Lotus for an engine that had never been fitted to any car. The engines leaked, warped, and failed by the thousand. Warranty claims poured in from 6,000 miles away. The money ran out. 700 workers made redundant in a single cut. A receiver appointed. A factory demolished. Today, the Kelvin Way site is 49 warehouse units, food wholesalers and plastic bottles where art objects were once built by hand. This is the story of two brothers from Birmingham who built something extraordinary in the Black Country, and the single decision that undid 40 years of craft in less than 3. Not through bad luck, through an engine bought without a warranty, from a man whose own company hadn't dared use it yet. Chapter 1. Two brothers and an Austin 7. The story begins in Moseley, a leafy suburb of Birmingham, solidly middle class, a long way from the soot and furnaces of the Black Country. Alan Jensen was born there in 1906. His brother Richard arrived 3 years later. Their father was a provisions importer of Danish descent. Comfortable, respectable. Not the kind of household you'd expect to produce two of Britain's most gifted coach builders. Alan apprenticed at Cirque Radiators. Richard trained at Wolseley Motors before moving to Joseph Lucas, the great electrical works that supplied half the car industry. They were learning their trades separately, soaking up the craft of Birmingham's vast manufacturing ecosystem. And then, sometime around 1927, their father made a decision that changed everything. He bought them a 1923 Austin 7 Chummy. The reason was mundane. Reportedly, to stop them riding motorbikes. They stripped it to the bones. What emerged was a boat-tailed sporting body, Jensen Special No. 1, and it was beautiful enough to catch the eye of Alfred Herbert Wilde, chief engineer at the Standard Motor Company. Wilde persuaded Alan to join the new Avon Body Company in Warwick, where he designed the first standard Avon open two-seaters. A second special, built on a standard 9 chassis, brought more attention. The brothers weren't tinkerers, they were naturals. Alan, the practical craftsman and businessman. Richard, the creative visionary with an eye for line and proportion. Together, they were formidable. A brief partnership with a man named J.A. Patrick of Edgbaston Garages ended in the kind of blazing row that only matters of pride can produce. Joe Patrick overheard a customer referring to Pat, mistaking Patrick's surname for one of the Jensen brothers' first names. An emergency board meeting followed, so heated that the brothers walked out that same afternoon. Their designs had been advertised as the Patrick Special. They were furious someone else's name sat on their work. It wouldn't happen again. In 1931, a neighbour introduced them to George Mason, whose family held a financial stake in W.J. Smith & Sons, a coach-building firm in Carter's Green, West Bromwich, dating back to roughly 1899. Smith still used horse-drawn carriage techniques. The brothers walked in as joint managing directors and within 3 years had transformed the operation, modernising production, raising quality, turning a profit where there had been stagnation. When old W.J. Smith departed around 1934, they bought a controlling shareholding. The company traded as Jensen Motors from that year, with the formal name change completed in 1936. They had an unusual arrangement, alternating annually as chairman, equal partners in everything. Richard pushed for innovation, for risk, for the next impossible idea. Alan counselled patience, managed the books, kept the operation grounded. They argued, they complemented each other, and they'd need both instincts for what came next. The breakthrough arrived wearing a Hollywood smile. In 1934, Clark Gable, the biggest film star on the planet, commissioned Jensen to build a special car on a Ford V8 chassis. It was exhibited at the Ford Motor Show at the Albert Hall before being shipped to California, and the effect was electric. Ford's executives drove the Gable car themselves, were impressed enough to grant Jensen permission to use Ford chassis, engines and spares, something previously unheard of for a small coach builder. Approximately 20 replicas sold through Bristol Street Motors. The first true Jensen car followed. The White Lady, a two-door sports tourer with a Ford 3.5-litre flathead V8. Sir Malcolm Campbell praised its superb workmanship. Two brothers from Moseley, working from a converted carriage, works in West Bromwich, were now building cars for Hollywood. The commercial vehicle side, fire engines, ambulances and eventually the JNSN branded truck range with its distinctive radiator grille, kept the order books full. Jensen Motors wasn't just surviving, it was beginning to matter, and the place where it all happened, Carter's Green, West Bromwich, sat in the heart of the Black Country. Chapter 2. The Black Country and the Long Climb. West Bromwich wasn't Mayfair, it wasn't even Birmingham. It sat firmly within the Black Country, that dense industrial belt named for the 30-foot thick coal seam near the surface, and the choking pollution it produced. The American consul to Birmingham, Elihu Burritt, had described the landscape as black by day and red by night. Charles Dickens wrote of factories that poured out their plague of smoke, obscured the light, and made foul the melancholy air. Tolkien is said to have based Mordor on it. But what the Black Country had, what it had always had, was hands. Panel beaters, trimmers, metal workers, iron founders, spring makers. 200 years of industrial craft concentrated into a few square miles of soot and canals. Jensen's factory drew specifically from this workforce, some of whom had served at W.J. Smith's since the 1920s. Stan Miller started at Smith's in 1920 and stayed through the Jensen years. This wasn't casual labour, it was inherited skill, passed down through families and across generations. The kind of expertise you couldn't train in a year or buy at any price. When the war came, Jensen proved exactly what that workforce could do. The Carter's Green factory was put at the forefront of wartime production and ended up on the Luftwaffe's hit list. They built light personnel carriers, fire engines, ambulances, 500-pound bomb casings, bomb crates, tank turrets, and Sherman tank conversions for amphibious use in the D-Day landings. They trimmed aircraft seats, fabricated barrage balloon facings, built rocket launchers, and ammunition cases. In November 1940, the Luftwaffe found them. Bombs struck the Carter's Green site, damaging stores and destroying much of Jensen's pre-war records. The factory kept working. Wartime profits, as one historian noted, put the firm in good stead when peace came. Peace brought a new problem. Someone had stolen their homework. Jensen unveiled the PW, the post-war luxury saloon, in July 1946. When Austin launched their shear line in 1947, Richard Jensen saw what everyone else saw, an exact replica. He confronted Leonard Lord at Austin directly. Lord, whether from guilt or pragmatism, agreed to supply Jensen with Austin engines, beginning a relationship that would sustain the company for 2 decades. Richard was livid about the copying, but he took the engines. The contract that truly kept Jensen alive wasn't their own cars. It was someone else's. From 1952 to 1967, Jensen built, assembled, painted and trimmed approximately 64,000 Austin-Healey bodies. By 1960, Austin-Healey work occupied over 40% of the workforce, around 350 of Jensen's 850 workers. As one historian put it bluntly, the Austin contracts were paying most of the bills. The 541 and CV8 were pleasant deviations for the Jensen brothers, but barely profitable. The Austin-Healey work forced the move that created the factory this story is really about. By the mid-1950s, Carter's Green was bursting, workers pulling night shifts, bodies stacking up. In autumn 1954, construction began on a new site at Kelvin Way, on the south side of West Bromwich, an open field with a canal and railway line. Architect Arthur Griffin drew up the plans. The factory became operational around 1955, and over the next decade it would grow into a complex of numbered bays, press shops, fiberglass departments, paint shops, trim shops, assembly lines, a development department, drawing office and dispatch area. Kelvin Way was purpose-built for what Jensen did best: handcraft cars to individual order, using the finest workforce the Black Country could provide. Meanwhile, the Jensen brothers' own cars were getting extraordinary. Eric Neal, born 1910 in Halesowen, a body designer who'd joined Jensen in 1946 after a cold welcome returning to Wolseley after the war, became the company's design genius. His masterpiece was the Jensen 541, first exhibited in October 1953. One of the first British cars with a fiberglass body, powered by a 4-litre Austin Straight 6, tested by the motor at 115 miles per hour. The 541 Deluxe was the first British 4-seater with disc brakes on all 4 wheels. Neal's work was beautiful, innovative, ahead of its time. But it was Richard Jensen who pushed for the truly impossible thing. The Jensen FF, named for the Ferguson formula, emerged in 1966, carrying technology that wouldn't appear in another production car for 14 years. Permanent 4-wheel drive via Ferguson Research's system. Dunlop Maxarette anti-lock brakes. A mechanical system where a flywheel sensed wheel deceleration and triggered a solenoid valve to reduce brake pressure. A Chrysler 383 V8 producing 330 horsepower. Tony Rolt, the Le Mans driver and Colditz POW, who'd helped build the famous escape glider, was instrumental in the 4-wheel drive development. Motorsport declared it the most revolutionary motor car of them all. Sports Illustrated called it the safest car in the world. Audi reportedly bought 3 FFs to study when developing the Quattro. 14 years later, only 320 were ever built. They couldn't be made in left-hand drive because the transfer case intruded into the driver's footwell, eliminating America entirely. Each gearbox was more of a hand-built prototype than a production unit. The FF was a commercial failure and a technological triumph. It was in many ways the Jensen brothers distilled, visionary, uncompromising, brilliant, and utterly uncommercial. Alan had urged his brother many times to give up the FF because it seemed to be getting them nowhere. Richard wouldn't listen. That tension between the practical and the visionary had held the company together for 3 decades. It was about to snap. Chapter 3. Italian Lines, American Muscle, Black Country Hands. The car that would make Jensen famous, the car that Frank Sinatra and Princess Anne and Led Zeppelin's drummer would buy, was born from a civil war inside the company. When a successor to the CV8 was needed, Eric Neal designed the in-house P66. It was handsome, capable, thoroughly Jensen. Deputy Chief Engineer Kevin Beattie and Managing Director Brian Owen, a Norcross appointee, the industrial holding company having acquired Jensen in 1959, rejected it. They commissioned Italian design houses instead. The winning design came from Carrozzeria Touring Superleggera of Milan, under designer Federico Fomenti. Bodies would be built by Vignale, a smaller coachworks based in Grugliasco, outside Turin. The Jensen brothers were enraged. Both Alan and Richard, along with Eric Neal, who'd given 20 years to the company, departed in 1966 in disgust. They had no hand in designing the most famous car to bear their name. Richard retired to Malta. Alan retreated to Brighton. The founding partnership, forged over an Austin 7 nearly 4 decades earlier, was over. What replaced them was magnificent. The Jensen Interceptor launched at the Earl's Court Motor Show in October 1966, and everything about it was excessive in exactly the right way. A Chrysler 383 cubic inch V8, 6,276 cubic centimetres of American muscle, producing 325 brake horsepower, mated to Chrysler's TorqueFlite 3-speed automatic. Autocar tested the Mark I at 0 to 60 in 7.3 seconds. Top speed, 133 miles per hour. Its most distinctive feature was an enormous curved wraparound rear glass window that doubled as a tailgate, one of the most instantly recognizable silhouettes in automotive history. You could spot an Interceptor a quarter-mile away. Nothing else looked like it. Nothing else sounded like it. Inside, it was a gentleman's club on wheels. Connolly leather throughout. Burr walnut dashboard and door cappings. Smith's gauges staring back at you from behind the wheel. Wilton wool carpets underfoot. Electric windows came as standard, unusual for the era. The ignition sat in the centre console, not the steering column. Every car was built to individual order, with what one historian called innumerable specification variations, making each Interceptor somewhat unique. Only 22 to 24 manual gearbox cars were ever produced. Virtually every Interceptor left Kelvin Way as an automatic. The torque flight was simply too good, too smooth, too perfectly matched to that enormous V8. Jay Leno would later describe it as a Dodge Coronet that went to college at Oxford. Bonhams called it less snooty and exorbitant than an Aston or a Bentley, but more luxurious and exclusive than a Jaguar. Haggerty's verdict caught the essence. A delicious combination. A proper English motor car with a voluptuous Italian body and a stump-pulling American V8. In 1967, a new Interceptor cost $8,124 in America, roughly double a Jaguar E-Type, yet comfortably below an Aston Martin. It occupied a niche that no other car on earth filled. Inside Kelvin Way, building one was an act of coordinated craft that took days to weeks per car. Steel panels were pressed under foreman Phil Eggerson, then welded to a tubular steel framework. Panel beaters lead-loaded the joints and hand-finished the bodies. Skilled work that couldn't be rushed or mechanized. Multiple coats of paint followed. Ted Fellows, who joined the paint shop in 1961, was one of the sprayers who gave each Interceptor its finish. And more Interceptors were produced in more different paint colours than almost any other model of the era. Every owner could have their car exactly as they wanted it. The trim shop dressed the interior in Connolly leather, cut, stitched and fitted by hand. Chrysler 5.8s and TorqueFlite transmissions were installed in the engine bay. Lucas Electrics and Smith's Instruments went in. Andrew B., recruited from Rolls-Royce, oversaw quality inspection, bringing standards from the most exacting name in British motoring. And at the end of the line stood Maud Pritchard, whose job was final preparation and cleaning. Her colleagues remembered her with something close to reverence. No one could clean a vehicle like Maud. Her attention to detail was phenomenal. You just didn't know there was glass there. The drawing office, where men like draftsman Nick Maltby worked, enjoyed an unusual degree of autonomy. A huge amount of autonomy given over to the men, unlike many other car companies. Progress chasers like Poutney kept the assembly line moving, chasing parts, managing bottlenecks, making sure 12 cars a week made it from bare steel to finished Grand Tourer. Bill Sylvester, a post-war works foreman who'd risen to works manager, held the operation together. Clive Kendrick, who'd worked the assembly line, remembered Interceptor production starting on the old Austin-Healey line in Bay 1 before being relocated to give it more room. This was not a factory in any modern sense. It was a workshop scaled up, a place where over 1,000 pairs of skilled hands shaped raw materials into objects that were, by any honest measure, works of art. Chapter 4. The car that rock stars drove. The Interceptor attracted a remarkable clientele. Frank Sinatra bought one, so did Princess Anne, Sir Cliff Richard, Tony Curtis, Cher, Linda Carter, Sir Matt Busby, Henry Cooper, Susie Quattro, Jackie Stewart, the novelist Harold Robbins, the thriller writer Frederick Forsyth, and Winthrop Paul Rockefeller. Eric Morecambe paid £4,500 for his in September 1968, and then suffered his first heart attack while driving it. He told Michael Parkinson it brought him sunshine. But it was the drummers who made the Jensen legend truly strange. John Bonham, Led Zeppelin's thunderous, ferocious drummer, collected multiple Jensens, running them on personalised JB plates. Ginger Baker of Cream bought no fewer than 3 Jensen FFs. Mitch Mitchell of the Jimi Hendrix Experience bought an FF new. Mick Fleetwood of Fleetwood Mac picked one up second-hand. As one historian put it, in the same way the royal family are remembered for their Rolls-Royce Phantoms, rock and roll drummer royalty will be remembered for their Jensen FFs. Something about those cars, the weight, the power, the controlled violence of a big V8 channeled through Ferguson four-wheel drive, spoke to men who hit things for a living. Back at Kelvin Way, the workforce that built these cars numbered over 1,100 at peak. Women worked alongside men. Jessie Pountney moved through assembly, fiberglass, and car cleaning during her time at the works. Brenda Deeming served as secretary to Kevin Beattie. Some workers traced their connection to the company back decades. Men who'd started at W.J. Smith's in the 1920s and stayed through the Jensen years until retirement in the 1960s and 70s. The works wasn't just an employer. It was a community with its own continuity, its own memory, its own pride. The Interceptor evolved through 3 marks. The Mark I, from 1966 to 1969, accounted for roughly 1,000 cars. The Mark II, 1969 to 1971, produced about 1,100 more. The Mark III, the most successful variant, ran from 1971 to 1976, powered by a Chrysler 440 cubic-inch engine, a full 7.2 litres, and accounted for over 3,400 cars. Then came the Jensen SP, the 6-pack, fitted with 3 twin-choke Holley carburetors, pumping out 385 brake horsepower. 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds, 143 miles per hour, the most powerful road car Jensen ever built. Only 232 were made. A convertible arrived in 1974 and an ultra-rare coupe in 1975, just 60 built. Total Interceptor production across all variants, somewhere between 6,400 and 7,141, depending on which variants you count and whose figures you trust. West Bromwich, this black country town of foundries and canals, of soot-blackened brick and metalworkers' terraces, was sending leather-trimmed, walnut-dashboarded, V8-powered Grand Tourers to Beverly Hills and Mayfair. The distributor network had expanded to nearly 50 Jensen dealers in the UK alone. Charles Follett, the prestigious London distributor, celebrated the sale of their 500th Interceptor around 1972. The press couldn't get enough. Autocar described the Interceptor as feeling fully mature and extremely well built. Road and Track praised it as excelling as a luxury car for long-distance travel. Others called it Ferrari-like exoticism at a fraction of the cost. For a small factory in the West Midlands, building 12 cars a week by hand, this was extraordinary. Chapter 5. The Summit. 1973 was the year Jensen reached its highest point, the best Interceptor production year, 1,166 cars. The Jensen-Healey sports car, the product that was supposed to transform the company from a boutique into a volume manufacturer, had entered production the year before and was ramping up alongside. Combined production hit 25 cars per week, leaving Kelvin Way. Contemporary press coverage treated Jensen as a success story, a small British manufacturer that had found its niche, somewhere between the aristocratic hauteur of Aston Martin and the mass-market ambition of Jaguar, and was filling it with confidence. The Interceptor's performance put it alongside the Aston Martin DB6, the Jaguar E-Type, and the Porsche 911S. Its character put it somewhere no other car occupied. The company had survived the loss of the Austin-Healey contract in 1967, the departure of its founders, 3 changes of ownership in a decade, Norcross in 1959, merchant bank William Brandt's in 1968, and the Norwegian-American distributor Kjell Kvaler in 1970. It had come through each transition bruised but intact. Looking at the production figures, at the press coverage, at the order books, you could be forgiven for thinking the worst was behind them. It wasn't. The Jensen-Healey was already in production. it was already being delivered to customers. And inside its engine bay sat a decision that would kill everything the Jensen brothers had built, every car, every worker's livelihood, every square foot of the Kelvin Way factory. A 16-valve, twin-cam aluminium engine designed by Lotus. An engine that had never been fitted to a Lotus production car. An engine sold to Jensen without a warranty. The most technologically advanced small car factory in Britain had bet its future on a power plant that wasn't finished. And by the time anyone understood the scale of that mistake, Jensen Motors was already bleeding to death. Chapter 6. The Norwegian and the dream Kjell Kavale, pronounced Kjell Kavale, was born in Trondheim, Norway, in 1919, the son of a sea captain. He'd immigrated to Seattle aged 10, become an All-American sprinter at the University of Washington. At 20, he'd unofficially tied the world record for the 100-yard dash, served as a US Navy pilot in the war, and then spotted an MGTC Roadster in New Orleans and saw his future. He founded British Motor Car Distributors in San Francisco and built it into a machine. By 1970, his organisation was selling more than 160,000 cars a year through approximately 80 outlets on the West Coast, distributing 10 different brands. He co-founded the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. He designed the famous corkscrew turn at Laguna Seca Raceway. Kavale was a man of enormous energy, genuine car enthusiasm, and absolute confidence in his own judgment. He also had a problem. In 1967, British Leyland had killed the Austin Healey. Kavale's dealer network had been selling Austin Healeys by the thousands on the West Coast, and now that pipeline was dry. He needed a replacement, a volume sports car he could feed to his dealers. Not a few hundred grand tourers a year, thousands. In April 1970, Kavale acquired a 70% majority stake in Jensen Motors from merchant bank William Brandt's. The strategic logic was simple and seductive. Control production, control distribution, build the cars in West Bromwich, sell them through his own network in California. He envisaged 10,000 Jensen-Healeys per year, primarily for the American market. 10,000 cars a year. From a factory that had been building a few hundred Interceptors annually. The ambition was breathtaking. Whether it was also reckless depended entirely on execution. Kavale installed Donald Healey as chairman. Healey was 72 years old, a legendary figure who'd won the 1931 Monte Carlo Rally, recorded 203 miles per hour at Bonneville aged 58, and created the Austin Healey brand, which had taken 3,000 orders at its debut in 1952. The Healey name carried enormous goodwill, especially in America. His son Jeffrey was given a role in the design department. The branding wrote itself, Jensen-Healey. Two names the American sports car market already loved. Healey had been working on a successor sports car since 1968, Project X500, and he knew exactly which engine he wanted, a Vauxhall 2-litre slant 4. Reliable, proven, available. But in US federal emissions specification, it was badly underpowered. It couldn't meet the target of 130 brake horsepower. The car would feel sluggish in the market Jensen needed to dominate. So began a search that reads, in hindsight, like a tragedy in 7 acts. BMW's 2.5 and 2.8-litre 6s were explored, too expensive at over 2,500 Deutschmarks per unit, and the platform had been designed for a 4-cylinder anyway. Jensen secretly rented a BMW 2002, removed its engine and gearbox, installed them in a prototype, then returned the BMW intact. Resourceful, perhaps. Desperate, certainly. BMW declined to guarantee supply of 10,000 units per year. Ford offered their 2-litre Pinto overhead cam and even a complete Cortina Mark III platform. The German 2.6 V6 was considered, but dropped when strikes disrupted supply. Saab and Porsche engines were reportedly discussed. 7 alternatives, 7 dead ends. And then came the conversation on a train. Chapter 7. The Man on the Train. In 1971, 2 Jensen technicians were travelling by rail, commuters, heading home after work, and they were talking about the engine supply problem. It was the company's open wound. Everyone at Kelvin Way knew about it. A Lotus employee sitting nearby overheard their conversation, introduced himself, and told them about a new engine his company was developing. That chance encounter connected Jensen to Colin Chapman. Chapman was one of the most brilliant and dangerous men in British motoring. He'd founded Lotus, revolutionised Formula One car design, won championships, built the Lotus Elan and Europa. He was also, as the Jensen Museum's account states plainly, a man of utter ruthlessness in business. He'd designed the Lotus 907, an inline four-cylinder, twin-overhead cam, 16-valve, all-aluminium engine of just under 2 litres, producing approximately 140 brake horsepower at 6,500 revs. It was the first mass-produced multi-valve engine available to the public. It used an innovative rubber timing belt instead of chains. On paper, it was extraordinary. There was one problem. It had never been fitted to any Lotus production car. The Lotus Elite, the car Chapman was developing it for, was still years away. Chapman needed someone else to absorb his research and development costs. He needed a customer willing to take the engine in volume, pay good money for it, and, crucially, work through whatever problems remained in the design. He needed someone like Kelvin Way. Chapman initially approached Kelvin, offering 60 engines per week. This was declined. He came back again. In October 1971, Jensen announced they would use up to 15,000 Lotus 907 engines per year. The Jensen Museum's account of what happened next is damning. Kelvin was already smitten with the idea of using a Lotus engine. Undoubtedly, it was the Lotus name and its racing pedigree that lured Kelvin in that engine direction. A name that could help sales of the Jensen-Healey in the USA. The museum continues. Kelvin was no match for Chapman's artful negotiating skills, and was even taken in with Chapman's overambitious supply forecasts. The problem was, Chapman was telling Kelvin exactly what he wanted to hear, and Kelvin was so driven with the idea of having a Jensen-Healey with a Lotus engine that he didn't want to dig too deep into Chapman's claims. Chapman was a man who could sell ice to Norwegians, and Kelvin was a Norwegian who'd been raised in America, a country that rewards optimism. The combination was lethal. Donald Healey, the man whose name would sit on the bonnet, preferred the Vauxhall engine. He was overruled. Richard Graves, Jensen's marketing director, called the arrangement an unutterable folly. His sales manager, Tony Marshall, urged him, "Dick, you must persuade Kelvin." Graves recalled later, "We were up against it, to be truthful." So, when we got the Lotus engine, everyone jumped for joy, except the sales and marketing department, who said, "You can't bring out an engine without warranty." Barry Wills, offered the position of chief buyer at Jensen, did something prudent before accepting. He consulted his former mentor at Jaguar, FRW Lofty England, Sir William Lyons No. 2, one of the most experienced men in the British motor industry. Lofty told Wills he should not touch it with a barge pole. He forecast that the Jensen-Healey's likely failure would bring down Jensen Motors itself. Wills declined the job. The engine cost £300 per unit, nearly double the £160 a Vauxhall engine would have cost. And to keep costs at what Kelvin considered an acceptable level, Jensen bought the Lotus engines without any warranty. Every repair, every failure, every blown gasket and warped liner and slipped timing belt, the full cost of every engine problem would fall entirely on Jensen Motors. This was the decision. Not the oil crisis. Not the emissions regulations. Not the 3-day week. Those were wounds. This was the hemorrhage. A small company with thin margins and no financial reserves had agreed to absorb the entire development risk of an unfinished engine at nearly twice the cost of the proven alternative, on the say-so of a man whose own company hadn't yet dared put it in a car. Chapter 8. Development by Owner. The first Jensen-Healeys reached customers in mid-1972. The problems started almost immediately. The Lotus 907s. Cork and card cam cover gaskets failed rapidly, letting oil weep from cam tower seals, cam covers, and every vulnerable joint. The engine was tilted at 45 degrees in the bay, and the aluminium construction made sealing particularly unforgiving. What might have been a minor nuisance in a conventional iron block became a persistent, visible, reputation-destroying fault. Owners opened their bonnets and found oil everywhere. The innovative rubber timing belt, one of the engine's headline features, slipped off the inlet cam. When it did, the valves bent. That wasn't a service item. That was catastrophic engine damage requiring a complete rebuild. Water pumps failed. Oil consumption was abnormally high. Engines burning through oil at rates that alarmed even the most tolerant owners. Oil pressure was slow to build on startup because oil drained from the cam carriers overnight. Cars parked on hills would have fuel drain from the carburetors into the inlet manifold, flooding and refusing to start. The horizontally mounted distributor vibrated so badly that ignition timing wandered. Cylinder liners, wet liners sitting in the alloy block, distorted under heat, causing further oil consumption and loss of compression. This wasn't one problem, it was an avalanche. Jensen had effectively become a beta tester for an engine that wasn't ready. As one account noted, the 907 had yet to be fitted to any Lotus, and Jensen ended up having to finish off its development after it had been fitted to the first customer's cars. Chapman would later introduce an improved version of the engine into his own 1975 Lotus Elite, after Jensen had done his development work for free. The supply side was just as catastrophic. Jensen stationed a factory employee at Lotus's Hethel. Works whose sole job was to report back to management twice daily, at midday and in the evening, with the number of cylinder heads and cam housings produced, actual versus plan. Even this surveillance couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Lotus couldn't make enough engines. Tony Marshall, the sales manager, described the cascading disaster. We were receiving a fraction of the number of engines promised by Lotus, resulting in early production figures way below forecasts. And all the while, the stocks of bought-in parts including gearboxes, wheels and tyres, exhausts, screens and glass were pouring into the factory each week as originally scheduled. Gearboxes were stacking up in stores with no engines to mate them to. Windscreens sat in crates, tyres waited on racks. Jensen was hemorrhaging money on inventory it couldn't use. Parts bought and paid for, sitting idle on the Kelvin Way factory floor while the production line waited for engines that arrived late, arrived faulty, or didn't arrive at all. Cuvale had targeted 10,000 units per year. In the first 2 years, only approximately 3,500 Jensen-Healeys were sold. A catastrophic shortfall. And the cars that did reach customers were coming back. Richard Graves stated it plainly. The first Jensen-Healeys had warranty claim after warranty claim against them. The Jensen Museum records that the company's feeble financial situation worsened considerably due to these claims. More than the first 2,000 cars were reportedly recalled for engine problems. 70% of Jensen-Healey production went to the United States. And when those cars failed 6,000 miles from the factory, they couldn't simply be driven back to Kelvin Way for repair. Every failure required a dealer visit, a diagnosis, parts shipped across the Atlantic, labour paid at American rates. The costs were astronomical, and every single pound came out of Jensen's pocket because the engines carried no warranty from Lotus. The press turned savage. The tide soon turned when it became obvious that the most reliable thing about the car was its lack of reliability. One owner's verdict became a devastating epitaph that would follow the Jensen-Healey forever. Body by Jensen, engine by Lotus, development by owner. The Mark II, introduced in August 1973, addressed many of the worst issues with a redesigned crankcase. But by then, the reputational damage was done. The Jensen-Healey name was poisoned, and it had poisoned the Jensen name with it. Approximately 10,453 Jensen-Healeys were produced in total, plus 509 Jensen GTs. Company debts rose to £3.7 million. The Interceptors, The cars that had made the company's reputation were, according to Graves, only marginally profitable. He suspected Cavalli was taking them at cost or near cost for his US distribution network, using them as loss leaders to keep his dealers stocked. The Jensen GT was being sold at a loss. By late 1975, approximately 1,000 unsold new cars sat jammed in Cavalli's American outlets. In his later years, Cavalli would admit what everyone already knew. "I made some big mistakes at Jensen," he told Classic and Sports Car in September 2000. "I guess mistake number one was trying to make the Healey in the first place." Chapter 9. The Unraveling. Everything came apart at once, in October 1973. The same month Jensen was trying to sell improved Mark II Healeys to a market that no longer trusted the name. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. The Yom Kippur War triggered the OPEC oil embargo. Oil prices quadrupled, from roughly $3 a barrel to nearly $12 by January 1974. UK petrol prices roughly doubled. Chancellor Dennis Healey imposed 25% VAT on fuel. The Jensen Interceptor drank petrol at 10 to 14 miles per gallon. Overnight, it became the most expensive car in Britain to run that wasn't an actual racing car. American emissions regulations were simultaneously strangling the engine. The Chrysler 440 had been progressively detuned, from 330 horsepower in the 1971 six-pack to 305 to 280, and eventually to just 255 by 1976. Each year, the Interceptor got slower, heavier, more expensive, and thirstier, a combination that would have challenged a healthy company. Jensen was not a healthy company. Britain's 3-day working week, imposed from January to March 1974 to conserve electricity during the miners' strike, hit manufacturing directly. Jensen couldn't run full production. UK GDP fell roughly 1% in both 1974 and 1975. The entire British economy was contracting, and Jensen, dependent on American exports for half its total sales, was caught between a domestic recession and an American market that was turning against big, thirsty European grand tourers. Inside Kelvin Way, the management structure was disintegrating. Carl Duer, the American management consultant who'd revitalized Jensen under Norcross, giving the firm enough of a lease on life to keep it going, had been forced out when Cavalli took over in 1970. His replacement, Alfred "Alf" Vickers, recruited from Rolls-Royce, was rarely seen by the workforce. He ran the company from his office. In July 1973, Cavalli fired Vickers, reportedly at a boxing match. Kevin Beattie stepped up as managing director. Beattie was arguably the most capable technical leader Jensen had. He understood the cars, understood the factory, understood the engineering. He also fell repeatedly ill through 1974, the strain of trying to hold together a company that was being pulled apart from every direction. In April 1973, Donald Healey and his sons Brian and Jeffrey withdrew from the Jensen board, severely frustrated seeing their reputation being damaged by the Jensen-Healey that was carrying their name. That same year, Healey received a CBE for services to export. A bitter irony for a man watching his name dragged through warranty claims. In October 1974, Cavalli demoted the ailing Beattie to Director of Engineering and appointed himself Chief Executive as well as Chairman. He was now attempting to run a struggling West Bromwich car factory from San Francisco. Production was cut from 25 cars per week to 12. Early 1975, 700 workers, 2/3 of the entire workforce, were made redundant. Imagine that. You've spent years, maybe decades, walking through those gates at Kelvin Way. You've pressed panels, trimmed leather, sprayed paint, chased progress. You've built interceptors that went to film stars and princesses. And now, 2 out of every 3 of your colleagues are gone. The bays that hummed with 1,000 voices are half empty. The car park that filled every morning is a patchwork of spaces. In the summer of 1975, Kevin Beattie died. He was 48 years old. the company's most capable remaining leader, lost at the worst possible moment. In May 1975, Richard Graves resigned. He'd argued furiously with Kelvin over a plan to move Jensen's operations to the United States. The final insult to a company rooted in the Black Country, built by Black Country hands. Graves told the press, "I'm worn out." Later, more quietly, "I was shattered. I'd had enough." On the 15th of September 1975, receiver and manager John A. Griffiths was appointed by the Bank of America, Jensen's principal creditor. He attempted to trade out of difficulty. Cars were still being built, or half-built, on an ad hoc basis with the receiver's approval. Some of the last Interceptors left the factory with fabric seat facings instead of Connolly leather. Whether this was to cheapen costs or simply to make the remaining hides last, nobody could say for certain. Either way, it was a desecration. A Jensen Interceptor without leather was a Jensen Interceptor that had given up. In October 1975, Jensen attended the Earl's Court Motor Show. The company was already in receivership. All 4 display cars were painted blue. The Jensen Coupe, the last new model, of which only 60 would ever be built, stood on the stand in Nevis blue, beautiful and doomed. Chapter 10. The Last Shift. In early 1976, news of the impending wind-up of Jensen Motors began to spread through West Bromwich. People who'd given their working lives to Kelvin Way felt it coming the way you feel weather change. A pressure drop, a chill that settles in. David Millard, the service manager, put it simply. "When I left work in the evening, I was never sure if I had a job when I went back in the morning." Clive Kendrick, who'd worked the assembly line, remembered the slow hollowing out. In the last couple of years leading up to 1976, I think we all knew the writing was on the wall. By that time, the place was just a shadow of its former glory. We felt like we were rattling around in this enormous factory complex, and with not very much going on. Rattling around. In a factory built for 1,100 workers, with a fraction of that number left, building cars that nobody was sure would be finished. In May 1976, Jensen Motors Limited ceased trading. The factory closed. Donald Healey tried to save it. He attempted to purchase Jensen's assets from the receiver, needing £1.5 million. He approached the Department of Trade and Industry for government financial assistance. No help was offered. British Leyland had been nationalised the year before with massive state support. DeLorean would later receive government funding in Northern Ireland. Even Aston Martin, facing an almost identical crisis at the end of 1974, had been rescued by an American-led consortium for just over £1 million. Jensen was simply not big enough to save. Not enough jobs. Not enough political weight. Not enough noise. No serious buyers emerged in time. In mid-August 1976, the factory premises and remaining assets were auctioned by Isaacs. 3 right-hand drive coupes were sold, 1 a glassless roof prototype, 2 uncompleted, all to the same buyer. The tools, the jigs, the drawings, the parts, the physical DNA of Jensen Motors, scattered to the wind. Ray Chester, a production supervisor who joined in 1952, had already taken voluntary redundancy on the 30th of April 1975 after 23 years. George Parker, head of maintenance, spent the final months assembling memorabilia from the factory, photographs, drawings, fragments, preserving what he could as everything around him was being dismantled. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that once the building was gone, these small things would be all that was left. Kelvin eventually purchased residual assets and formed Jensen Parts and Service and Jensen Special Products. He'd invested heavily, lost heavily, and would spend years supplying parts for cars whose reputation his own decisions had damaged. In the interview he gave to Classic and Sports Car decades later, he was candid about the mistakes. But candour after the fact doesn't reopen a factory or give 1,100 workers their livelihoods back. The Kelvin Way factory, the complex of numbered bays where panel beaters had shaped steel, where Maud Pritchard had polished glass until it disappeared, where Clive Kendrick had rattled around in the empty spaces, lay dormant after closure. The main building was demolished between 1978 and 1981. Two small successor operations survived in portions of the site. Jensen Parts and Service in the old service department, and Jensen Special Products in the development department, bought by employees Alan Vincent and Ray Alsop. Limited Interceptor production, the Mark IV, restarted in 1982 under Ian Orford. It passed to Unicorn Holdings in 1988, which built approximately 36 more before going into receivership in 1992. Martin Robey of Nuneaton bought what remained in 1993. What was left of the old Jensen premises was reportedly taken over by a manufacturer of plastic bottles. 6 attempts have been made to resurrect the Jensen name. 6 times, different groups of men with money and ambition and genuine love for those cars have tried to bring the brand back to life. A factory near Jaguar's Halewood plant produced roughly 20 cars with canyon-sized panel gaps and exposed wiring before collapsing into administration. An announcement promised a new Interceptor built at the old Jaguar plant in Coventry. Nothing materialised. Clay models were shown, press releases were issued. Nothing came of them either. The Jensen name attracts revival attempts the way a flame attracts moths, and with roughly the same outcome. The most enduring effort is Jensen International Automotive in Oxfordshire, backed by Charles Dunstone of Carphone Warehouse, which produces the Interceptor R Restomod. Existing cars rebuilt with GMV8s, making up to 556 brake horsepower. Beautiful machines. But Restomods of surviving cars, not new production. In January 2026, they announced an all-new GT, a clean-sheet Grand Tourer inspired by the 1960s Interceptor. Teaser images only. No prototype shown. As one motoring journal noted, "Here's hoping third time is a charm for the Jensen name. Hope is cheap. Factories are not." Chapter 11. What remains? The Kelvin Way. Trading estate is a commercial and industrial estate comprising 49 warehouse units totaling 278,000 square feet. Food wholesalers, industrial suppliers, distribution firms. One visitor described it as hardly recognisable as the Jensen factory. Just looks like a generic industrial estate. There are no heritage markers, no plaques, no memorials, a place where art objects were built by hand, replaced by anonymous sheds. 3 miles away, the old Carter's Green offices survive as Jensen House, renamed, used as council offices. The most tangible remaining physical link to Jensen in West Bromwich. The name sits on the building like a ghost sign, legible but disconnected from anything living. The most remarkable afterlife belongs to Bob Edmiston. Jensen's financial controller and company secretary walked out with a £6,000 redundancy payment. He used it, plus a loan, to take a 15% stake in Jensen Parts and Service. That stake evolved into International Motors, which gained UK franchises for Subaru, Isuzu, Maserati and Hyundai. By 2013, Edmiston was ranked 209th on the Sunday Times Rich list, with an estimated fortune of £440 million. The company that made him redundant was worth nothing. The man it made redundant became one of the wealthiest people to emerge from any British car factory closure. Gilbert Hughes, a trimmer, moved to Jensen Parts and Service after the closure. He headed the much-reduced trim shop, keeping the craft alive in diminished form, repairing and maintaining the cars his colleagues had built at Kelvin Way. When Hughes died in 2003, 49 former Jensen staff attended his funeral. Nearly 3 decades after the factory had closed. The bonds forged at Kelvin Way outlasted the company that forged them. West Bromwich itself tells the wider story. Sandwell Borough is now ranked among the most deprived authorities in the West Midlands. Manufacturing employment across the region has declined by 13 percentage points since the mid-1990s. The retail anchors, Woolworths, Littlewoods, BHS, are all gone. Jensen's closure was one death among many. Bilston Steelworks, Round Oak, Patent Shaft, Rubery Owen, Baggeridge Colliery. MG Rover at Longbridge collapsed in 2005, taking 6,000 direct jobs and 25,000 in the supply chain. Jaguar's Browns Lane closed the same year. Peugeot near Coventry followed in 2006. Castle Bromwich. Jaguar Assembly ended complete car production in 2024. Paul Quigley, a Black Country archaeologist, caught the transformation. The heir to 200 years of iron making has now disappeared under a Poundland depot. While Leicester has found a king buried under a car park, we have Elizabeth, last queen of the Black Country blast furnaces, interred under a discount superstore. A tired Jensen Interceptor can be bought today for the price of a good sofa. £6,000, perhaps 10, for a car that needs everything. Rust and V8 thirst. And a badge that never carried racing cachet have kept prices below comparable Aston Martins and Jaguars. But the finest examples are climbing. A 1974 convertible sold for £86,250 in April 2025. A 1973 SP reached $135,000. The cars are becoming art, treasured by collectors who would never daily drive them, preserved in heated garages, driven on summer weekends. The workers who built them are mostly gone now. The skills they carried, panel beating, lead loading, hand finishing, leather trimming, were learned over years and cannot be recovered from a manual. The drawing office with its unusual autonomy. The paint shop where Ted Fellows and his colleagues produced Interceptors in more colours than almost any car ever made. The assembly line where Clive Kendrick watched the workforce dwindle, and where David Millard went home each evening not knowing if he'd have a job in the morning. Jensen Motors was a small company that built some of the most technologically advanced and beautiful cars in the world. The first production car with four-wheel drive and anti-lock brakes, 14 years before the Audi Quattro. Grand Tourers for Frank Sinatra, Princess Anne, and a remarkable number of rock drummers. Hand-built in a Black Country factory by craftsmen whose skills reached back to the age of horse-drawn carriages. It bought an untested engine without a warranty, and it bled to death in 3 years. The Kelvin Way trading estate. 49 warehouse units, food wholesalers and plastic bottles. And somewhere beneath the concrete, the ghost of a factory floor where over 1,000 skilled hands once built things that were, by any honest measure, beautiful.